tell us a little bit more about?
Oh, okay.
It's nice to know Zoom is talking to us. I love that American lilt. Fantastic. There are some little things in there, as you can see, about asking to keep, because we're running through Zoom, we don't want thousands of tons of feedback on these sorts of things in terms of microphone feedback. There's also the lights in this room can be a little bit, I would say, eclectic in the way, which means that they sometimes come on, sometimes come off, and some fade to left, right. And it's all down to people coming out the back or down the front. It's because it's a hybrid system. If we move, they come on full bright. If we stop moving, they go off. Yes, you can see my little problem with that one, but don't worry about it. I'm doing lights and microphones at the end there. These guys are helping out with the Zoom side of it, and that gentleman who's lurking over there, Ed, who's going to be telling us a lot more stuff. I'm pretty sure that's coming up. So, Toy and Fran, if you'd like to take it on, I shall step to one side and just let you guys take it on.
Hi everyone, so I'm Victoria Burton. I'm the Membership Administrator of the Amateur Entomological Society, which is a society, national society for people interested in insects, particularly beginners and youngsters. So our Bud Club is our junior group. And yes, so we got together with the Royal Entomological Society to do a junior version of their famous Verrall Lecture.
So, hi all, I'm Fran. I work for the Royal Entomological Society, and I'm really happy to be here. And I'm so happy that our lecturer for this year, our Verrall Lecture, Ed, has agreed to do this young Verrall Lecture as well. And I'm also happy that we're actually with the Staffordshire Invertebrate Science Fair today. I've never been to this event before, and for those who are online, I'm sorry you've missed out on such an awesome event that's happening outside as well. So yeah, just to say, we'll be doing questions after Ed's talk. And for those of you who are online, there's a Q&A module, so do add those questions in as the talk goes through. I'm just going to set something up so make sure we can definitely see ourselves. Okay, and our camera is definitely on. That looks good, fantastic. So I would now like to introduce Ed Turner. So Ed works at the University of Cambridge. He's an associate professor and he's a curator of insects in the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. He's also a fellow and tutor for access and outreach at Clare College, Cambridge, and he works in conservation. And the talk we had on Wednesday for the adult audience, so to speak, was really, really impressive, talking about different projects in Southeast Asia. And I'm not going to give any more spoilers about what Ed might do today, but he has brought some props with him, and I'm quite excited as to what he's going to do with them. So without further ado, can we hand over to Ed? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's actually a pleasure to be here. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Perfect. So I was told to expect, is it going to work? There we go.
Oh, sorry.
Your upcoming events. Do you want to say your upcoming events where you're at?
That's okay.
There's some great upcoming events. I was going to introduce myself first of all. So my name's Ed. I think we've got the adult one up here actually.
Oh.
Not the yeah, that's definitely. I'm
so sorry.
That's all right. Let's put the. I think you might not want the fully adult
okay. One. I'm so sorry about this.
Lots of.
Can we go back to your email? So
yeah,
sorry.
I can
Yes, if you want to go ahead, Ed, I'm really sorry.
That's all right.
Sort it. So I've got a couple.
There is. I have put some sort of plots in and stuff. I'm told that adults love figures and plots and graphs. So I've kept some of those in for the adults. I've got some other stuff here for the younger audience as well.
So you might want to pause the actual recording of the main event whilst we go and find some stuff. Whilst we go in and is that the one? Yeah, so let's get back onto it. Okay, we ready? Part 2, anticipation, kids building. Fewer graphs, but probably still a few of them.
Few graphs, but not too many graphs.
But not too many. Excellent.
So I was going to start by introducing myself. So my name's Ed. I work for the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge, where I'm the Curator of Insects. And that basically means I look after their insect collection. We've got this huge collection. You can see a few of it there, these beautiful large copper butterflies behind me. And these ones, a massive collection of over a million insects, which we look after, been collected for the last 150 years or so. And we think these are really important because they tell us about how things were 150 years ago. It's the closest that an entomologist or an ecologist or a biologist can get to time travel. So we can go back that time, we can find out what was living in the UK or worldwide 150 years ago. There's more or less no other way you can do that. I was told to say a little bit about how I came to this. You've mentioned the Amateur Entomologists Society before and their wonderful bug club, all that sort of stuff. So I did that back in the day when I was probably about your age or thereabouts, which was great fun. So you can go and find loads of insects and learn more about the natural world. So I highly recommend that as well. What I wanted to talk about today was really about insects. I've always loved insects. I think they're one of those things you can look at wherever you are in the world, no matter if you live in a flat in the centre of London or a big city, or if you live in the depths of the countryside, there are insects all around you. How many of you like insects? A show of hands for how many of you like insects. Adults have to do this too. Yeah, everyone here likes insects. That's a good. I was wondering if there was anyone I had to convince. It seems like they've got the preaching to the see that. But all of you, I think, yeah, all of you like insects. Most people in the world don't. You might have found this from talking to your friends and family and things like that. I mean, I'll do things again when I was a kid. I used to have these wonderful tarantulas and all kinds of things like that. And it's surprising what a negative response I got from a lot of my family. I don't know if you found similar things. So one of the things I want to start off with was thinking about why insects are important, why they're interesting, why they're important to study, all of these kind of things. Unfortunately, nowadays there are fewer insects than there were when I grew up. There are fewer insects than there were 150 years ago when most of our collections in Cambridge were made. Things aren't doing very well for insects. That doesn't mean it's impossible. There's lots of things we can do about it. We can be conservationists. We can make the world better for insects. We can increase numbers. I wanted to finish off the talk by thinking about ways you can do that. I'm going to try and introduce some of the studies that I've been involved with. I'm really lucky in working in the museum. We've got a fantastic collection. It's also open to the public. We have about 13,000 visitors a year, I think, something like that. Come and look at our collections, come and look at the museum. Because I'm in Cambridge, I also work with fantastic undergraduate students who are studying entomology sometimes, but biology in general, to find out more about the natural world. And I've also got a really good team of researchers that I work with. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the research we're doing to try and understand how the natural world works. I'm also going to attempt to run an experiment for you, which is actually ongoing as we speak. It's got a replicate size of 1, so I'm hoping to get a really significant result. What we're going to do is to see if that works. It should do. It did last night in my front room, but it probably won't now. I think the air conditioning might be a bad thing. So first of all, I want to think about the number of insects. Why insects are important than just their sheer number. This graph won't help you actually, but I wondered. I'm told I'm going to make these talks more interactive. It's interesting actually, because when you say that, people suddenly don't stop making eye contact. But I was wondering if any of you knew how many different species share the world with us. How many are there? I mean, you're all foolish and said you're interested in insects and put your hands up just now. So obviously one of the first things we might ask is how many species there are, how many distinct different types of insect. I won't pin you down to insects. That's okay. That's a bit hard. How many species in general? Any ideas? Got a hand in the back there. What do you think? Do you think 100? A zillion is definitely a gazillion. A gazillion is a really high number. And who knows, you might be right. Another guess there. It's a very high estimate, good estimate. 10 million is a very good guess, a very educated guess, I suspect. Yep, that's absolutely right. Any other advances on 10 million? You have fewer than 10 million, you think? Or more than? Between 10 million and gazillion, do you go higher or lower? How many people? Hands up if you think lower. Hands up if you think higher than 10 million. That's interesting. Of course, the answer is we don't know, which is interesting in its own right. We've been studying the world, the biology of the world, for about 200 years, and we don't know how many species share the planet with us. That's quite a remarkable thing. What that means is there's loads of undescribed biodiversity out there. I can tell you how many species have been formally named, and that's around about the probably 1.4 to 2 million mark. So much fewer than 10 million. And that guess with 10 million is a pretty good one. It's now thought there's probably between 5 and 8 million species in the world. So what that means is only a tiny fraction of those have been formally described. But if you were to draw a pie chart, as scientists love to draw pie charts, this is my pie chart here, which you can see here. This is the diversity of animal life, or life on Earth rather, generally life, which has been named, which is the about 1.4. I can't even tell you how many have been named exactly, because some things have accidentally been named twice, and lots of things we think of as just one species are actually loads of different species. They just look similar to us, to humans. So we live in an incredibly undescribed world. It's really, really interesting. But if you all focus your eyes a little bit, kind of slightly close your eyes and stare at the pie chart there, what you'll notice is that roughly 3/4 of it is blue. And that means it's an insect or something closely related to insects. So most of the diversity of life is insects rather than anything else. And that's something I think often other people find really surprising. If you're not interested in insects, you don't realize quite how many different species there are. They're extraordinarily diverse. About 1 million of those, so that blue is insects, and maybe 400,000 of these, about half of that blue, are beetles, incredibly. That's thought not to be the most diverse group now. 3 other things which are even less described. So it's all this amazing diversity of life, scuttling and flying and running all around the place. What that means is, if you start looking for these things, you can find new species rather easily. This isn't that newer species now, but it's the newest one I've got, which I actually keep. And this is something beautiful. You've got those amazing stick insects outside, which you can handle. This one, I'm not going to let you handle, but I brought some more in if you want to afterwards. And this is...
Apparently we have a technical issue from
the online.
Yeah, from the online community.
Sorry, online community.
That's right. But there's some of those outside as well. They're fantastic creatures.
Yeah. So let's fix that. And I can show you, because I can go away from here. And I can show you this piece of insect, which if you haven't seen these outside too, have a look. This is something called a Peruvian black beauty stick insect. It's absolutely gorgeous. Now, normally stick insects don't behave like this. It's kind of wandering around all over my hands. Normally they behave pretty much as they're meant to, like a stick.
Fantastic. Very good.
We're back then, are we?
You have a look at this after as well. I don't know if you can see what colour its wings are. You see, you need young eyes to see what colour its wings are. So what colour is it? Red, reddy pink. So this is red and black. Any ideas why it might be red and black? Behaving perfectly, good trend.
Forest fire?
So not forest fire, actually, more direct than that. Often if something's red and black, would you like to eat a ladybird?
Red and black. Don't attack.
Red and black don't attack. So this is, so we are there to see it, the online audience, there you go. Is that in focus? It's actually behaving beautifully. So this is one of my actually one of my children's pets. So I had to sneak this away without telling them this morning. Otherwise they get quite cross. So this has got what's called warning coloration, aposematic coloration is proper name. So the reason it's doing that is red and black is basically it's telling predators, don't eat me. I'm really nasty to eat. And what it does is it produces poison from the back of its neck if it's disturbed. This one doesn't do that for me because I handle it quite a lot. So it's kind of realized I'm not trying to eat it. It's quite safe. It's absolutely right. It's unusual for an insect. This is the reason I put this one in for a stick insect. The reason I put this in is because it was first named in 2005. So it just illustrates again, for even quite large, charismatic insects, there are new things turning up the whole time. We live in an extraordinarily undescribed world. So if you grow up to be an entomologist, if you decide to change career and become an entomologist, which I very highly recommend to everyone in the audience, whatever age, you've got a good chance of finding stuff that no one's found before, whether that be species or whether it be stuff about what those species are doing. Oops. And if you were to look at the total mass, so if in terms of the number of species, insects dominate in terms of the number of species named. Strangely, they also dominate in terms of the animal mass in the system. So we don't see this because when we walk around, insects look tiny. We think they're going to be pretty light if you scrape them together. That's not the case again, especially if you go into the tropics. This is based on real data from the Amazon, from the tropical rainforests in the Amazon basin, and where researchers basically worked out how much mass, weight of different animals there were in the system. And because there's so many insects and so many ants, particularly in termites, if you scrape them all together, this is what you get in terms, it's called a biomass scape. What we've got here is the size of the organism represents the relative weight of that organism in the ecosystem. It's probably the reverse of what you might think. It's dominated by social insects, it's dominated by other insects, what that butterflies in meant to illustrate. And then you've got really minor, unimportant groups like mammals, represented by that jaguar in the New World tropics. So again, it's not the world you might think. Insects are much, much more important, much, much more ubiquitous than people think. Earthworms are really important as well. I love the kind of enormous earthworm. perhaps because of all the different species you get, and all the different range of stuff and their sheer mass, insects are also really important in terms of what they do in the world. I've given a few examples of that here. We've got a beautiful honeybee at the top. I don't need to tell you what they do, of course. They pollinate as a whole suite of different, huge diversity of pollinators, pollinating all these flowering plants, incredibly important for that. Anyone any idea what this one is here? It's got a really interesting mouth part. Yep, it's definitely a hemiptera. It's a true bug. Not a weevil. I say it is a true bug. So that group of insects which have got piercing mouth parts. It's got a really big one. Any idea what it might feed on? Clue. If you again. Assassin bug, absolutely. So it's called an assassin bug because it looks like it's going to stab another insect, and indeed it does that. So it eats other insects. So it's really important in lots of our crop systems because it feeds on pests. It's a really beautiful one. It's one we work on in Southeast Asia. What about this beetle here? What type of beetle? It's got a very particular type of food it feeds on. Not a snail. Not a snail eater. It's one of the dung beetles. So it's a really important dung beetle. Without these things, we'd literally be kind of knee deep in the pool. So these things are really, really important because of all the processes they do in an ecosystem. They carry out all this stuff. They're functioning. They're sometimes described as the little things that run the world. And they really do. I've also put in these beautiful weaver ants at the top here, just mentioning the social insects, things which are more numerous than any other group of organisms really on the planet in terms of the kind of larger things. And they can dominate how the whole ecosystem works. These things are really important because they affect how ecosystems process. Unfortunately, one of the things that's come out in the last few years, and you might have seen this in papers or heard about it, is the so-called Insectageddon, number of insects declining worldwide. And that is true, it is happening. Insects are declining, whether that be number of species or whether it be in terms of number of individuals. This is one of my figures, so bear with me here. But what we've basically got here is a study which has studied studies. It's called a meta-analysis. What they've basically done is they've looked at all the different research which has got long-term data on how insect numbers are doing around the world. And you can see that in the dots here. So that's where all the studies took place. And they brought all of that together and they basically said, well, okay, for these long-term data, how are insect numbers doing? What they found was that for terrestrial things, so things living on land, insect numbers have been declining about 9% per decade. These long-term data sets, that's pretty bad. Slightly more hopeful in terms of the freshwater systems, where they've been increasing. But the likelihood is this is being driven by where these studies were. Most of this work is in North America and it's in Europe because that's where we've got really long-term data. We know hardly anything about the tropics, where most species live. So unfortunately, we need to do stuff to help insects. They're clearly not doing very well globally, certainly on the land anyway. You can also get a longer-term view from looking at collections like ours. And if you start doing that, again, you find things. It's not uncommon to find species which used to be common in an area, which are just no longer found. I've given you one example here. This is a really beautiful butterfly called the large copper butterfly, which used to be found all around Cambridgeshire up until about 1850, 1860, so again, 150 years ago. And then it disappeared. And that was because at the time, they drained loads of big wetland areas, big ponds and swamps, and they turned it into agriculture. They turned it into farmland. And this was something that disappeared. It was a subspecies which was found in the UK and nowhere else. So it's restricted to our part of the world, something you won't ever see in the world again, apart from in our collections. So these things matter because you lose stuff which is irreplaceable, which is beautiful, which is unique. And there's lots of reasons why this happens. One of the main ones, the main driver of this change worldwide is habitat change. This is based on real data. This is where we work in Southeast Asia, we work in Malaysia and Indonesia as one of our collaborative projects. We do something there in England as well. And what we're looking at here is just the structure of the tropical rainforest compared to an agricultural crop. This is oil palm. You'll have all eaten oil palm probably over lunch or palm oil over lunch today. It's in absolutely everything. It's really important in vegetable oil. And what happens is you basically get this really complex forest where trees can go up to 80 meters or even more, up to 100 meters now. If you imagine having you at school run 100 meters, you don't run 100 meters anymore. But imagine how tall those trees are. That's the length of the tree if you laid it down. And you're converting all of that structure, all that complexity into something which is up to about 12 meters tall. So you're losing lots of habitat, therefore you lose species as well. Of course, nowadays, there's also the impacts of warming temperatures as well. We're living in a world which is getting hotter and hotter because of greenhouse gases. This is just kind of showing how the temperature has increased on the top here in relation to human release of carbon dioxide, burning of fossil fuels, changes in habitat. And this again has a real impact on insects, because if you think about it, there's a tiny insect you're basically responding to the temperature in the environment. So we're quite lucky, we're large bodied, we can heat up nicely when it's cold, and we can cool down, we can sweat. We need to sweat, and that's just nerves of talking to you in front of an audience. But we can cool down by sweating when it gets too hot. Often not the case for insects. They basically have to kind of cope with what's in the environment. They can do certain things, but it means they're particularly vulnerable, susceptible to these sort of changes. That really matters. Certain things they can do, but not so much as us. And that's really true as well if you go across different habitat types as well. So this is looking again, remember I have the forest here and the oil palm plantations we saw before. And this is data loggers. I'm going to show you here. This is one of my colleagues who put these all out. And these little things here, I don't know if you can see them, they're like little kind of watch batteries, the things you get in kind of watches or small toys and things like that. But these are computers. What they do is they measure temperature every 20 minutes or so for us. We can put them out in different habitats and we can leave them there and we can collect them up and we can see how temperature and humidity as well. They've got a little hole in them that measures humidity too, unless the rain gets in which case they just break. But they measure temperature and humidity for us over 24 hours. And we can leave them out for months and months. And one of the things my colleague did, this guy called Stephen, was he put out these data loggers and he measured temperature change in oil palm plantation, which is the agricultural habitat in grey, and then 2 different types of forest in blue and pink. And what he looked at here is over 24 hours what the temperature looks like. And this won't be a surprise to you in some ways. So as it got hotter in the day, it was when it got to the day, middle of the day, it got hotter. As it got to the night, it got cooler. That's not very surprising. But the big thing was, if you look at that right-hand graph, which is the temperature, look how much higher the bar gets, the line gets in the grey compared to the blue. It's about 4 degrees hotter in oil palm plantations than it is in forest. It's much, much warmer in the day, not much cooler at night time. And the same is true of the humidity. So humidity is how wet the air is, how much water vapour there is in it. And it gets much, much drier in the oil palm plantation in the middle of the day than it does in the forest. And so the result of that is that insects within these systems are basically coping with really extreme temperatures, baking hot temperatures, and also very, very dry conditions when it's in the middle of the day. That difference in temperature is way more than we might predict over the next 100 years from global warming. But it can happen instantly when you remove a forest. So there's loads of different things that are affecting insects worldwide and perhaps explaining why they've declined so much. So one of the things we've been really interested in our group is trying to find out how insects can cope with this. Ways they can buffer their temperature, cope with extremes of temperature, cope with effects of temperature change related to habitat loss and things like that. One of the things we've been doing, both in the tropics and also in lovely Bedfordshire, is to measure butterflies' temperatures. That's what we've been doing here, actually. So this is my little experiment for you. But one of the things we've been doing is across loads and loads of different habitats, we've been going out and we've been recording the butterfly temperature. What we do is basically use a net to catch the butterflies. And then if you're good, you can record their temperature in about under a minute and let the butterfly go again. We'll be very good at this. We're very careful not to chase them because, of course, if we chase them, we might be heating them up. And then we record the air temperature as well. What we can basically do is we can see how well butterflies can warm themselves up versus the air temperature. And that's what's shown here for this large white butterfly. I've got a pointer or something, doesn't make too much. So if you're looking at the graph, shall I use? Oh yeah, perfect. I can use that. That's all right. Actually, I can use the arrow. Perfect. So if you're looking at the one-to-one line here, this black line, this is basically if the butterfly was doing the same thing as air temperature, the points would be right along this line, i.e. butterflies would equal air temperature. If they're above, it means they're warmer. And this is as air temperature goes up. This is probably the most scientific bit of my talk, so bear with me. What this is basically showing is that for this large white butterfly, when the temperatures are colder, it's relatively much warmer. As the temperatures go up, it gets relatively cooler. And indeed, when it gets to really hot temperatures, it can be below the air temperature. It can cool itself down. So that's a species that's doing really well. It's not like us. It's not kind of producing the temperature within itself. It's rather it's changing its behavior, enabling it to be more of a constant temperature than the environment. So that's doing brilliantly. And perhaps it's not surprising the large white butterflies found right across the UK. If you're a gardener, you'll be horribly familiar with things like the large white butterfly because they're a pest and they feed on cabbages and things like that. Then you've got other rarer species, things like this Duke of Burgundy, which are really rubbish at this. So as it gets hotter, they get even hotter. So these are the kind of things that we might predict do rather badly with global warming. And indeed, it's one of the things that we found out. It's a horrible graph, but don't worry about this too much. What this basically shows is that different families do better or worse. Families of butterflies do better or worse. And as their wingspan increases, they get better at buffering. So larger body things are better able. This is really interesting for us. This work by Andrew Blake, I've shown up there. And what he's basically found is that you can predict which species might do better or worse with warming temperatures. Any ideas how butterflies can do this? Like how on earth is a little thing like a butterfly able to change its temperature? Two main ways.
Are they clever enough to impact the shade?
Actually, we have both answers there. Yeah. So who is the shade? Who is the shade answer? Perfect. Yeah. So the shade answer there, and then you have the wings at the front. Yeah. So actually, these are the two main ways they do it. So they can both either they can seek out cool microclimates, we call them, so like cooler areas, or they can bask, or they can close their wings to reduce, well, basically acting like solar panels. So we call that kind of behavioural buffering, or kind of like or seeking out a microclimate. And it turns out, again, different species do different things in different ways. And if you look across the whole UK, species which seek out microclimates, seek out cooler bits, they've been doing worse over the years than species that are able to buffer their own temperature. So really interesting, again, just differences in how things do stuff. I've been trying to set up an experiment here, because what I've got is now two peacock butterflies, I'm going to show you here, which are from the collection in Cambridge. And I've been angling them against my artificial sun here. So this one, I've been angling away from the sun. That's what a butterfly would do if it wanted to reduce its temperature. And the other one I've angled towards the sun. That's what a butterfly does if it wants to increase its temperature. And what we do to measure this is we use this little tiny bit of wire here, which has got a tiny temperature probe on the end. So it means you can record a butterfly's temperature just by touching against the butterfly. And I was wondering if I have a volunteer from the audience to come and help me read the butterfly's temperature. And then we have two actually. Do both of you want to come in? Yeah. See if we can do this. This is almost certainly not going to work. It worked at home and it works in the wild, but never work with that. See if it works. Right, so I'll keep talking. We're basically, for those online, we're going to be putting a bit of wire on the butterfly. So one of you first of all. So you're going to do the warm, loving one. Third one. Can you see the end of the wire there? So grab it with your hands. So I want you just to touch that onto the body of the butterfly. And I'm going to ask my friend here to read off how many numbers. What's the temperature? Wait for it to cool. We'll go up a bit first. Go up. Keep it there. Still going up. Yeah. What does it say? Very good. So this one, the heat butterfly, is 21.6 degrees. It's gone up again. 21.6 degrees. So it's been warming up. Now that's the one that was facing towards the sun. Let's try this again. It's literally what butterflies do. Do you want to go with the wire this time? And we'll swap round. So you're touching it just exactly as your colleague did onto the that's it, onto the floor, actually a little bit of butterfly, that's it. That's it. Don't worry, that's it. Make sure it's actually on. That's the right. It's going to go. It's going the wrong way. Well, actually, try going right on the ring of butterfly. No, absolutely no effect at all. Look at that. It worked so well last night. So actually, we've got exactly this. No, a little bit lower. 21.5, a full 0.1 of a degrees cooler. Thank you. Make sure it's works. So if you put it on the screen, see it now go up massively because you're definitely warm-blooded. So your finger is 26.2 degrees. Where are you? Crikey. It's sitting on your hands. 30.3 degrees. Very good. Well done to both my helpers. Thank you. So for the online audience, we're basically just putting these either in the sun or not. So that didn't work particularly well. It works much better with living butterflies. But what they basically do is by doing things like that, seeking out cooler climates, or by angling their wings to the sun, they can change a lot how they do in the world. They can change a lot how they can cope with increasing temperature or not. And that turns out really important. So I wanted to finish off. So it's clear there's lots of things which are going on with the world. There's things that insects can do to respond. What I wanted to do in the last bit was just think about kind of what we could do to help insects as well. And there's loads, of course, different things we can do to improve things for insects. A lot of you have loads of fantastic wildlife societies out there in the hall today, including the Wildlife Trust. And one of the things we've been doing over the last 15 years, 20 years or so, is working a lot with our local Wildlife Trust in Cambridgeshire, which is the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, North Hampshire Wildlife Trust. The Staffordshire Wildlife Trust out there doing equally brilliant work. And of course, one of their jobs is to look after reserves, look after these special places where insects and other species are still found. And one of the things we need to do to conserve insects, of course, is to keep those areas safe. That's absolutely key. That's the single thing that will save most species in the world. But that's not enough. What we also need to be doing is we need to be linking these areas together. We need to be making them bigger, because that's going to be better for species that are found there. It's also going to mean they're much, much more robust. They're able to cope with the effects of climate change. This is a really nice example of this from when I first started working for the Wildlife Trust, way back in 2006, when I started working with them. We had two reserves, which are what's shown at the top here. It's Tottenham Quarry Reserve on the right-hand side, and there's one called Tottenham Knolls on the left. And there are two beautiful areas of chalkgrass and absolutely stuffed full of amazing insects, turtle doves, loads of other species, but they're isolated. And then what's happened over time is, you see, new areas of reserve have been built. So what was two reserves is now one reserve under continuous conservation management. This is absolutely the thing we must be doing. It'll make all the difference in the world, really will. The other thing we can do is restore habitats in areas which are not good for wildlife. I'll give an example again. There's some fantastic examples actually in the hallway there about people doing exactly the same thing. But in our part of the world, the big project, just on our doorstep, is the Great Fen Project. What it's doing is basically buying up agricultural areas and re-wetting them to turn them back into fens, linking together two patches of fen that have been isolated for 150 years since that large copper butterfly disappeared. That makes all the difference again. This is the biggest single chance of actually bringing some of these species back. Really amazing work, really, really important. But that's not the only thing we need to do. We also need to be thinking about ways that we can manage habitats, which are there for us for growing food, but to make them better for insects. And one of the projects we've been working on a lot in oil palm plantations, the habitat I was talking about before, is doing just that. So what we've been doing over the last 10 years or so is working in Sumatra, which is in Southeast Asia, near Borneo. And we've been working with an oil palm company. And we've been getting them to change the way they manage their habitats and looking at how that can benefit insects. So what we've got here is it's a proper experiment. So I promised I was going to tell you a little bit about experiments. What we've done here is we've got whole loads of different plots, which are all quite big, 150 meters by 150 meters in oil palm. And what we've basically got is areas where we've set them all up, we've monitored them for a year, and then we've persuaded the oil palm growers to change their management. And that was either to reduce the understory to be more intense or to let it all grow, stop using herbicides at all. So we've got a whole range of different environments. This is called what we call reduced, this is business as usual, this is enhanced. You can see the effects are quite dramatic. If you stop spraying herbicides, then you get much more vegetation. Of course, that's increasing complexity in the same way as having a rainforest is increasing complexity, although up to the same extent, of course. And what we've been doing is looking at the effects of this on loads of different species of insects and also other types of animals and plants. We've found pretty consistent results. What we've basically found is, this is for butterflies. This is work from Valentine Ariswilova, who's one of the members of our group, and Andreas Advento, who's shown on the top here. And what they basically did was they looked in these oil palm plantations, they looked at the numbers and the number of species of butterflies. They basically found where you've got more understory, you get more abundant and higher numbers of species of butterflies in these systems. We also worked on other insect groups, other arthropod groups as well. How many of you like spiders? Yeah, okay, good. Not as many as insects, but still probably a third of the audience. These are one of my favourite spiders in the world. I think these are absolutely beautiful. These are called Nephila spiders, golden orb weavers. And they're really massive. They get to that sort of size, and they hang out in oil palm plantations and in forests at roughly head height. So then you really do amazingly, like, although they're enormous, you walk into them surprisingly often. I like spiders, but you suddenly they're quite a shock. One of the things we were able to do is look at how they benefited from understory. And what we basically found was, over time, numbers were kind of decreasing more in the reduced plots if you remove the understory than in the other plots. So having more understory benefited these spiders as well. You got far more of these things when there was lots of understory vegetation. And they've also got really weird other spiders that live with them. So that one I showed you there, that's a female. The male Nephila spiders are actually tiny and orange, and they hide in the web. They just basically live with the females who do all the catching and all the active stuff. But then there's also these other little spiders that look like male Nephila. They look like male golden orbits, but these are thieves. They're kleptoparasites, which means they steal the food of these big spiders. that's one of the ones here. They're beautiful little tiny things. You get sometimes 20 of these in a single web. And basically, when a thing lands on the web, the Nephilim spider will rush over, but so too will all these other little spiders to try and eat the food first. It's an amazing bit of biology. And one of the things that you find is their numbers also decline. As you increase, you get more understory, decline if you've got less understory. So you've got the whole suites of different animals which are benefiting from this, not just the spiders themselves, but spiders feeding on the food of the spiders. Amazing. And if you put all that together, sorry, it also changes the functioning as well. So one of the things that's really nice with Nephilim spiders is you can walk around, and you can literally walk around a plot over an hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours and just see how many things it catches, because there's that many. And it turns out, again, when you've got more understory, you get more prey capture. So what that means in an agricultural setting is there's more pest control. It's important, it's good news for the farmers as well. The final thing I wanted to think about was ways that you can manage environments to actually benefit the microclimate, to mean it's more variable so that insects can cope with changing conditions. If you remember from the UK example, insects that rely more on microclimates rather than angling their wings to the sun are ones that are generally doing worse. And if you look at habitats, this is just a nice image just to show how this works. This is looking at an alpine region with a thermal camera here. So you're looking at a habitat which looks quite similar, just a patch of grassland. And then through the thermal camera, you can see the differences in pattern for the same patch of ground. Red is hotter, blue is cooler. You get a difference of kind of degrees in a single area, just where there's more water, where it's facing away to the sun or not. So you can do things to manage that as well, to make the areas more variable for insects. If you can do that, of course, you can start to help them cope with the effects of global warming. And that's what we've been doing in working again with the Wildlife Trust in Bedfordshire. This is work from Matt Hayes and Esme Apjeston here, who are both in our group. What they've been doing is working with the Wildlife Trust, who have been putting in these amazing E-shaped banks onto areas they're reserved. So what you do is you basically bring in a digger and you change a flat area into an area that's got banks and facing different directions, done in an experimental way. But what we've been finding is that this can provide a whole range of different temperatures for insects. So it's mainly making something that was completely flat and uninteresting, much more variable, both in terms of the plants and species that are found there, but also in terms of the temperature, the microclimate. And in a funny kind of way, the extreme temperature we had, eerie, isn't it? The extreme temperature we had last year was really helpful for us.
I apologise for it.
That's frozen. There we are. Well, what we were able to do is we went out. I don't know if you remember last year, it got really, really hot in the summer. In fact, it got over 40 degrees in the UK for the first time in recorded history. And our health and safety team in Cambridge said, make sure you stay indoors. Please don't go out. We went out and did some field work, and it was fantastic. And we went out and we looked at our butterfly banks and we recorded what butterflies did in that really extreme temperature day when it was over 40 degrees. It was over 39 degrees on our sites. And that's what's shown here. We looked at the activity and we looked at whether the butterflies were in the shade and whether they're in the shelter. And that in our sites was basically where there were butterfly banks. What we basically found was when it got really hot, the activity dropped down to nothing. There was no butterflies found on the site, although normally there are hundreds. And the only place we could find them was in the north shady bits of our butterfly banks. So again, it was doing exactly what we were hoping. It was providing the right sort of climate for butterflies to cope with extreme temperatures.
So are you better having your E facing south and they go behind it, or does your E face north?
Well, we're not sure yet, actually. We need to start doing that. So they were using, because it was such extreme, they were literally using any north-facing slope. So it didn't seem to have any particular effect. But we're quite interested in, we think that the reason they've got the E's is to have either, as you say, either shelter or exposed. And we suspect that's going to be more important for the spring heating up side of things rather than the cooling down side of things.
They will let us know if you want it.
We certainly will. Yeah, I'll come back and do another talk. Yeah. A few other things which I think everyone else can help with insects. One of the things, I suppose, to make sure to get insects, to help insects cope with the future, one of the things we need to be doing is basically more of us studying insects, more of us finding out about insects, and absolutely anyone can do that. It's really, really important. I was going to give you one inspirational study, which has done just that, and that's from Jeremy Thomas up here, who's based in Oxford, but he did his all studies insects his whole career. And one of the things he was able to find out about was the intricate sort of the history, life history of a particular species of butterfly, and that's this large blue. I wanted just to give an example of how this can turn things around for insects, how it can make stuff much better for them. This was a species that went extinct in the UK, disappeared from the UK, the year I was born, which was 1979. And part of the reason for that was it had a really special relationship with ants, which is what's shown at the top here. I don't know, how many of you know the story of the large blue? Probably quite a chunk of you. Half. That's right. Enough of you not to. They've got a really weird bit of behaviour. So little blue butterfly, about big, and they hatch on short grasslands mostly, and also heathlands. And they'll basically mate and they'll lay eggs. Females lay eggs. And they'll feed on wild thyme. The larvae shed their skins really rapidly. It's all kind of normal butterfly-ish type of caterpillar behaviour. And then when they get to a certain size, they fall to the ground. They swell themselves up and they make squeaking noises. That's very unusual behaviour for your average caterpillar. It turns out what they're doing is they're mimicking the cries. They're pretending to be baby ants, which make crying sound when they want to be fed. And so with our particular species, what then happens is the ants, one particular species of ant, takes them below ground, puts them in with all the rest of the ant larvae, and there to add insult to injury, what these little caterpillars do is they feed on the ants. They're parasites. An amazing bit of biology. And it turns out what's happening on these sites was the grass was getting a bit too long. Temperatures were getting a bit too cool in this case. The ants were disappearing, and therefore the butterfly disappeared. One of the things Jeremy Thomas was able to do was basically find that out, work out exactly what the ants needed, therefore bring the ants back, therefore ultimately bring the butterflies back. They're reintroduced. And this graph is showing the number of colonies of the butterfly in the UK from 1950s through to the sort of 2008 or so. So the number of colonies dropping right down, and now look at that, going right back up. There's more colonies of large blue butterflies in the UK than there have been at any point in the last 80 years. It's a huge success, and that just basically comes down to knowing about them and spending a bit of time watching insects and finding out what they do. It's very temperamental, this.
One pointer. Use the buttons to shift.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess for all of you as well, a lot of people in the UK have got gardens, or if not, maybe got some window boxes and things like that. That's the other thing we can all do for insects. We can make our gardens a bit less tidy. We can plant window boxes for pollinators, for things like that, and it's a huge difference. And this is my garden here. It's wildlife gardening, so you don't have to it doesn't have to be pristine. In fact, it's better if it's not. That's the sort of thing again we can all do. And I suppose the final thing we can do involved in research, and again, a lot of you will be doing this already, is getting involved in things called citizen science approaches. And again, I know that the Royal Entomological runs several of these approaches. There's other amazing ones across the country, things like big butterfly counts, or counting the number of birds in your garden, the big garden bird watch. I don't know how many of you did that this year. But this sort of stuff is fantastic because it gives information at the whole country scale as to how natural history is doing in the UK. Better than the lighting system in here, anyway.
You're not wrong.
But this is the kind of thing that all of us can do, no matter what age, really. And it's not just a matter of increasing awareness. It gives data which is genuinely really valuable. This is how, in the UK, we know more about our species than more or less anywhere else in the world. It's really, really important. So, hopefully, more or less in time, what I've tried to do over the last half an hour, a bit more, I suspect, we kind of sort of interrupted a few times, is kind of get you thinking a little bit about why insects are important and interesting, and why we should all be entomologists, in fact. Still time to change, as I say, if you've mistakenly taken a different career path. And then we've been thinking about ways that we can manage those environments to make it better for insects. And finally, just thinking about the things that everyone can get involved with to do that. And there's tons of things. Again, the advantage of studying insects or being interested in insects is because they're everywhere and they're endlessly interesting and endlessly diverse. The benefits of their conservation is you can do that conservation on the same scale. You can do insect conservation anywhere in the world and it will have a benefit. So I'm going to finish there. I have brought some other insects if you wanted to hold some non-toxic ones. So you can look at those, but if not, have a look at the pink butterflies, and I'm very happy to answer any questions as well, both from our online audience, and sorry for all the mistakes, and our audience in person as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Apologies for loading the incorrect slides at the beginning, but yeah, you've done a fantastic talk, and I think it's been accessible to all of the audience. So we do have two questions. We've just seen them popped up online, and I think Dave is going to help with the in-person microphones in the room. So let's ask one of the online questions first, and then if you've got a question in the room, maybe you can put your hands up and Dave can get ready for the next one. So maybe the first question could be, how can someone become an entomologist?
So I'm guessing this is a sort of professional entomologist, but the journey is kind of the same. So to study insects, you basically just want to spend time looking at them. That's the number one most important thing. And I think by my definition, I reckon anyone who does that is already an entomologist. If it's a younger audience that's asking the question, I think joining the Amateur Entomologist Society is probably a key way of doing it, because you get to meet loads of people who are really interested in insects as well, and you learn from professionals. You can get kind of better at identifying insects, and identifying them is probably the first step to be able to study them. You have to know what they are, and then you can see what they do. Ultimately, if you're looking to do that kind of longer term, there's things like, obviously, think about what GCSEs and A-levels you're doing, depending on the stage. And of course, you can go on to study in university as well, either entomology in particular, but usually biology, which is a nice way of understanding how the whole natural world works before going into research, if you want to, or into an NGO, a non-government organisation, charity like the Wildlife Trusts, or like the Amateur Entomological Society or the Royal Entomological Society as well. There's loads of different options. There's lots more ways to become an insect enthusiast and entomologist than there were in the past.
Okay, are there any questions in the room? Anything popped up? It can be, we've got 2 questions. Dave, are you able to? Yeah, so in the very back, I can see someone. Oh, are you okay? Yeah. Do you want to go to the very back, Dave? And Ed, do you want to answer the second question while Dave gets there? Do entomologists get interesting? Oh, sorry, no, Dave, you go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Yep.
How do butterflies roll their tongue into their small mouth?
Really good question. So butterflies' tongues are a really interesting bit of evolution. So evolution is how things change over time. And there's lots of examples of how insects look or behave, which is about getting access to nectar or to resources from flowers. And the butterfly's tongue, which is probably named as a proboscis, and moth tongues are the same. They're evolved just once at the same time. An example where insects have evolved a particular tongue literally to get the flower nectar. So an example of a novel evolutionary trait. And the way they work, if I can put a piece of paper, let's do this. My model butterfly tongue. If you look at a butterfly tongue, if you were to cut it in half and look at it in cross section, what it looks like down the length, it's not round. Actually, it's slightly kind of oval, like that sort of shape. If that makes sense. Like a kidney bean. That makes sense. So my model tongue is going to be like this, but you have to imagine it's a little bit more kind of rounded. That makes sense? You see that from the back, okay? Now, there's 2 things about it. It's got little tiny muscles inside it, and they're quite important. But the other thing is it's slightly kind of elastic. It will kind of roll up anyway. And it's got some bigger muscles at its base, which is kind of where the butterfly's nose is. This is my butterfly impression. I hope you were impressed. If it's rolled up, you imagine that the muscles can contract a little bit, and it's also a little bit elastic. The tongue kind of does that, but even more so. So it goes, this is an important piece of paper. It goes like that. That looks a bit like a curly butterfly tongue, yeah? And if it wants to roll it out, oh, sorry, there you go, online audience.
Rolled up paper.
Yeah, you should have attended in person, you see. Much better experience. You do get to avoid the lights. So butterfly tongue rolled up like that. What they can then do is they can contract the muscles in their nose and they can make it extend. So what they do is they contract it down because it's rolled up and it's flattened. Ta-da! Extended tongue, contracted tongue. So that's how the butterfly's tongue works, and it's the same with moths. And in some cases, they can be unbelievably long. So different species or different groups of butterflies got different length tongue. But the most famous one is things called Darwin's hawk moth, where the tongue is 27 centimeters long.
Okay, let's do one of the online questions like we almost did earlier. So, do entomologists get interesting expeditions overseas?
Yes. We go where we can do, yeah. I mean, I try and do, so for our overseas work, we work lots with different collaborators around the world. So most of our tropical work is based in Indonesia and in Malaysia, where we work with researchers from University of Malaysia and IPB University, and also researchers from the oil palm industry as well. So we get to go to trips out into Malaysia and Indonesia and look at insects in the rainforest sometimes if we're very lucky, and in oil palm plantations as well, which can also be really interesting. So, yeah. But working in the UK is equally really, really good.
Fantastic. Dave, there's another question in the middle. Someone with a white jumper.
I'm going back to one of the research for I'm just interested to know how to change the habitats when you're back. What were the changes?
Yeah, really good question. So if people didn't pick up, it was kind of how did they change the habitat for the large blue? And it was mostly down to grazing. So these areas, grassland areas, were heavily grazed kind of pre-World War I, really. And obviously with changes in agricultural practice and things like that, which got even worse or even more different maybe after the Second World War, lots of these grasslands, which weren't very productive, basically stopped being grazed. And so what happened was they grew up a little bit, the scrub encroached a little bit, which is good for some wildlife. But in other cases, things like large blue, it basically meant the grass got too long. And above it's really specific what these type of ants want. Above a certain length, the ground was just a bit too cool. And so what the work there was able to show was basically the grass sward, the height of the grass had to be like less than 10 centimeters, I think, I can't remember, something along those kind of lines. And so basically they just had to increase the grazing a little bit. And that had the result of heating temperatures, populations of the ants went up. They're still on site, they just declined a bit, and they weren't productive enough to support the butterfly larvae, which obviously are eating their larvae and stuff as well, so making it even harder for them. With that small change, they were able to make sites basically favourable to these butterflies. So when they were reintroduced, they spread.
Okay, let's go to one more online question, which is a very big question. How did insect wings evolve? And if you don't want to answer it, but you might have a really great answer for that.
It's a really good question again. So people have been thinking about this quite a lot. And there's various different ideas that people have had, like, I don't know if you know what mayfly larvae do. They've got an interesting thing where they have two molts after they've got wings. And one of the things that mayfly larvae can do is they can use their wings to sort of, what's it called when you've got a windsurfing kind of thing? They can use their wings to kind of skirt across the surface of water. So people were thinking, oh, maybe that's how these wings first evolved, essentially that. Nowadays, it's thought that's probably not the case. What's probably happened, the reason that wings have evolved is to do with basically gliding from one tree to another to escape predation. And that becomes really important when you've got plants, when you live in a 3D world. And that obviously happened to insects after plants invaded land. And there's some really nice examples of lots of insects basically using their slightly flattened bodies to glide as opposed to actively fly. And that's really what wings are. They're just extensions of the body which got much larger, eventually developed strong enough muscles to enable them to actually do independent flight. And there's some great experiments. You can look online actually, if you Google skydiving bristletail, I think you'll probably find it. There's experiments where researchers basically were working on rainforest canopy trees, and they did things like I don't know why they were doing it actually, but they accidentally did it first of all. They threw an ant off the top of this tree, or a bristletail. And one of the things they noticed was it didn't just fall to the ground, it kind of went out and then went back and landed on the tree. And it turns out loads of insects do that. They can paraglide. So they're light enough, they can just be a little bit flatter, and they can land on this tree, and therefore they can jump off and escape predation without falling all the way down to the ground and have to climb the way back up again. It's a very effective defense response. And there's really nice footage, I think, of from a researcher called Yanoviak or something like that, who took lots of images of this for bristletails, which are a very kind of basal group to insects, and showed that they can do that as well. So nowadays, that's the most likely route that insects evolved wings. They basically became more and more flattened until these kind of projections became true wings. You can try this as well, actually. So I've been lucky enough to be in the rainforest quite a lot, and I've tried throwing ants off trees. And I've had less success than this group has done. The first time I did it, I kind of threw an ant off a tree, and it went right back and it landed. I was like, oh, this is brilliant. And then I realised it was because the wind was blowing towards me, and it never worked again. But you can all try that.
Okay, shall we have some more questions from in the lecture room? Hands up. Go ahead, Dave, maybe to the very back again.
So a question from the entomologists at the back.
Dragos always fly down from trees with their head pointing to the ground.
What were the first two words?
Why do Dragos have a lizardy?
Oh, Dracos. Good question. So this is these flying lizards, Dracos, as in the flying lizards. Yeah, they're really cool. So they're doing a escape thing very often. So they've got amazing, again, they're an example of a glider. So actually it's a really good example because it's rather similar to what ancestral flying insects might have been like. And what they do is they've got these amazing flaps of skin which are between their ribs, which it looks like when you see them in the trees, it looks like they've recently lost loads of weight. They've all got kind of like flappy kind of bits of skin all around them. And then when you disturb them, they kind of jump off. Their heads are quite big, so I guess that might look like they're going down. But they can basically spread their beautiful ribs, and they can glide, and they do the same thing. They'll kind of land on the tree. Usually when they land, they do this before they land. So they're head down, gliding, and they do that. And what they're actually doing is they're doing something in flight called increasing drag, which means they can basically slow down in the air. Same thing the aircraft do when they're coming to land, they kind of do that. And it means they can slow down and they literally just kind of hop onto the tree and they're off again.
Okay, should we get one more in the room? Oh, someone's just needed.
Are there any weird insects like the duck-billed platypus? Like how that's weird?
Very good question. Are there any weird insects like the duck-billed platypus? I think most insects to lots of people are weird because they're so unfamiliar to us. They can kind of do all sorts of different things. My favourite one in terms of the weird body shape is something called a violin beetle, which is something you get in Southeast Asia, and I've seen it several times. And its body shape is literally like a kind of a long, thin head, and then its wing cases, its body is really wide. It looks exactly the same shape as a violin. And that's my favourite. It's very flattened. Yeah.
Okay, should we do one more from in the room? I'm just mindful of time right now. Any more questions in the room? Oh, there's one down the front here.
Project.
We'll do it with the online microphone, just so we get the full
The
recording.
people online.
Yes.
Yeah.
With the interactive with schools.
I was interested in what you were saying about land for decreasing, freshwater for decreasing. And I was wondering what was driving that, and also how the fact that a lot of insects have like a stage in water and a stage on land, and how that affects them.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So what's most likely driving it is that the areas where most of the studies were done, as I say, were America and North America and Europe. And there's been the highest levels of habitat change, which is probably why you're getting a really big signature of insects declining on land. But at the same time, over the last, most of these studies, there was a kind of chart where you can see how long the studies were. Most of them were in the last 30 years rather than being longer than that. And that coincides with what the Clean Water Acts have come in. So strangely, our waterways are doing better with our wider habitat. So likely this is a signature of some of that actually being effective for freshwater organisms. We don't really know what's going on in the tropics where most insects live. So it's unclear whether tropical insects are declining so much on land or whether they're recovering so much in freshwater. So lots of things for new entomologists to do.
Okay, I think Dave just said we have a bit more time, possibly. Okay, I think we should look at some of the online questions. The first one's quite long. I wonder if you could read it out and maybe I'll try to answer it at the same time.
I might not be able to answer this one. So how did different groups of moths evolve similar sex pheromones? Well, groups between have drastically different ones. Is it just a case of convergent evolution or having access to the same base pheromones for modification? I don't know, actually. I don't know enough about pheromones to be able to answer this. This is one for a kind of a professional, one in the audience who knows more about this. And what I would say is that generally speaking, when it comes to evolving different ways of attracting mates, it tends to be that species that live, which are closely related and that live with each other, tend to have very different ways of attracting things. Things that live in different areas may have similar ways. And the reason is you basically don't want to choose the wrong species to mate with. So that's a common pattern. That doesn't answer your question.
And do you want to go for the next question? Is there any research trying to communicate with insects like we are trying with other species like whales?
So insects do see some really interesting communication, and there's lots of research looking at how insects communicate with each other. And there is some work doing things like there's a group that's developed a robot bee. It's quite fun. So they can basically mimic a waggle dance or a figure of eight dance to try and tell bees where to forage for resources. So in a sense, yes, they are doing that. And there's some really nice work which has looked at kind of how insects communicate with each other. One of my favourite studies, quite an old one now, but it was looking at how whether ants can teach a special form of communication. It was carried out by Nigel Franks's group in Bristol. And what they basically did, they've got these beautiful kind of like colonies of little tiny ants they can keep between, small enough to keep between microscope slides, and so tiny. And one of the things they were able to do was basically look at whether ants responded to each other. So the definition of teaching and learning is for the teacher to respond to the pupil and the pupil to respond to the teacher. And what these ants do is when they lay down pheromone trails, that relates to the previous question, but pheromone trails to basically get to new foodstuffs. And what they found was on these trails, a leader ant would basically be kind of walking along the trail, another ant would be kind of following along. I don't know why I'm doing an ant impression there, make it more real for it. If the ant got a bit behind, it would try and speed up to catch up with the leader. And if the leader realised the ant behind was a bit slow, it would slow down. So it's teaching and learning. So lots of communication, quite sophisticated communication going on in insects. And it was discovered the same year that teaching was discovered in other vertebrate species, within meerkats. It turns out ants can do just the same.
Okay, we're getting close to 3:30, so I think we should actually stop things here. But thank you so much, Ed, for all those exciting questions. And thank you to those in the room who managed to answer questions as well, and ask questions rather. And thank you so much to Dave for letting us host this in person, and for all of you for joining online. Yeah, a big round of applause for Ed. Thank you so much. Okay.